Welcome, everybody. I have returned once again to do another episode of Storytime with Jack. Now, I know what you're thinking. I don't really do much in the way of videos, and this time it's something of a special occasion. For you see, today marks the day, the 10th anniversary of the fall of Space Valkyria 1. So let us go along down memory lane once more and find out just what happened 10 years ago. Now, as I've already previously shown, there were certain efforts and experiments taken to make an end base multiple times. We are at this point in early 2015. Now, I'm just going to skip over the previous stuff with Warmonger, as that's more or less boring. All you really need to know is that Warmonger was unfairly, but also humorously singled out and more or less driven to a state of frothing anger. At which point he showed lolcow symptoms and people just kept going at him. I could go more in depth on that, but I won't, because lolcows and the attitudes people have towards lolcows on the internet is a very storied topic and not one for this video. So we're not going to worry about that. The important part here, however, is that Warmonger is now public enemy number one. And at some point during 2014, I was never really privy to it, but at some point, Asgard 2 had been established. I was technically invited, but I was away playing a mod pack of my own. This mod pack was mostly just me enjoying the mod Thaumcraft and a few other sundry add-ons to just sort of get my mind off of 2B2T. Because the last 6 months of 2B had basically been boring as sin. There really weren't any major events happening from roughly July of 2014 onward. The griefing of Warmonger was really the only fun part of 2014, even if it wasn't necessarily deserving. It was, well, the highest point worth talking about. After that, I began to experiment with banner patterns, as banners were, of course, brand new at this time. It was also at this time that I discovered an odd quirk with nether portals. You can see a short here on what exactly that mechanic was. But needless to say, there's something of a relic, and if you find such portals today, and there are a handful of them scattered throughout the server, well, just take a peek through. Who knows what you'll find on the other side? And so inevitably, I got bored playing this little mod pack. It was single player and there weren't any real challenges to it other than the natural progression available to the mods. But once I had conquered all of that, I decided to, as I always do, return to 2B2T. This time, however, I was quickly greeted by Pyrobite and Sato saying that I had been invited to the next big base. The biggest base since Valkyria. That base, of course, being Asgard 2. Asgard 2 was not too dissimilar from Valkyria. Everybody there would build in whatever form or fashion they wanted, just sort of throwing whatever they could muster using local and duped items. But inevitably, as people are off to do, drama emerged, and the base, of course, fell. In amongst all of this was our beloved April 1st shebangs. And I do mean bang with an emphatic sort of bang. It's a pun because this was a unique April 1st in which players could use a TNT command, which we would later learn was written by iTristan, to spawn in any amount of TNT they wanted and then, well, blow things up using a flint and steel. This interesting little experiment of what could be considered the first little on-the-fly music generation was something of an oddity. For you see, in addition to the TNT that everybody enjoyed using, there was a further experiment where random note block notes at different pitches were continually being played as a sort of broadcast to all players on the server at once. We've not really seen a return to this experiment since, but it was certainly interesting. Shortly after this interesting experience, we immediately headed into 1.8, and I departed from my Mushroom Island pair of dice and set out for Asgard 2. It is here at Asgard 2 that I would meet many long-term players whom you might even remember now. James Russells, Coconut, Victor 96, Henry, and Spartan 512. Many people would enjoy their time at Asgard 2. However, I only had just arrived and not even 2 full weeks later since the April 1st, 2015 experiment moment, the base was already ready to be destroyed. Apparently, Pyrobyte had inadvertently leaked the coordinates and, well, the jig was up and public enemy number one, Ormonger himself, showed up. And basically we all decided to collectively grief Asgard 2 before Ormonger could get the chance. This naturally meant that all the items and building materials, including a bunch of lovely new banners, was just lying in wait to be picked up as everybody was too busy griefing. Naturally, I saw fit to do exactly what I have been known for doing. If there are items lying around and no one is going to claim them, or even worse, these items will just get destroyed if they stick around too long, I figure it's always a better idea to take them with you and preserve them instead of letting them get destroyed. And so that's what I did. And thus I made my way back to Spawn. For the first time in a long time, I stepped foot on Spawn's endless wasteland. And I decided that today was the day. 1 year after the 2014 temp map, in April of 2015, I realized that no one was concerned with the end dimension. Due to the drama that had unfolded at Asgard 2, Sato had called what is now known as the third incursion. And while that was definitely an interesting experience, and I will include more of that here in a moment, I was primarily concerned with traveling out somewhere at the time we considered to be far in the end dimension in order to establish a base that at first I never expected to blossom the way that it did. But now today I can look back on and say pretty firmly that this was the beginning of what I was going to become. This was the Jacktherippa you all know today. This was the birth of that Jack. The Jack that would go on to create bigger and badder and more impressive bases. This is the Jack that had come into his own as a builder. And it is here on April the 16th that I would begin building Space Valkyria. Now, a little bit on the naming convention of Space Valkyria. Originally, the build that everybody now synonymously knows as Space Valkyria, the build that you've been seeing a lot of this B-roll footage throughout this video, has predominantly been misconstrued, shall we say. In truth, this build's original name was the Sky Pillar of Autism, named so for the original version that I had made in 2013. The version that as I was making it, and you can go back and see this particular episode of Storytime with Jack to help to corroborate this. When I was building the Sky Temple of Autism at the lands, all the while as I was building that build, I realized if I had made this over the void, it would be 10 times cooler. And as I began making what would eventually be the Sky Pillar of Autism, I realized that instead of building outward and building a temple that's more, well, I'll just use Pyrobyte's words to draw the parallel. Pyrobyte, when he first saw the Sky Temple of Autism, likened it to a Mandelbulb, which is using the Mandelbrot algorithm to generate, the Mandelbrot set. But instead of it being a flat graph, it's a three-dimensional graph, which in turn produces a three-dimensional polygon. It's a really beautiful object, and you can see I will compare the two side by side here of what a Mandelbulb looks like and the Sky Temple of Autism. Clear, obvious similarities, though I didn't exactly take inspiration from a Mandelbulb explicitly, but it's just fun how geometry tends to kind of repeat itself. So instead, because I had the whole 256 blocks with the Sky Temple of Autism, I had to build that floating above something. It was over the ground in the overworld, so I couldn't expand too far upward. But with the Sky Pillar of Autism, I instead wanted to make a large pillar that acted as both a tower and as a central farm location for all the farmable items that you could at that time replicate reliably. This also meant that I could go crazy with the building theme because this was going to be exclusively my section of Space Valkyria. Now, the idea was that it was going to be very much like Valkyria, Asgard, Fenrir, Asgard 2, and so on. All the big Sato bases now that are synonymous with the Valkyrian Eagle. That was the theme we were going to work with for Space Valkyria. It wasn't going to just be the big stone brick tower that everybody now associates as Space Valkyria. It was going to be the corner of Space Valkyria. And we were going to build bridges and other things going off in this, that, and the other direction in order to ensure that everybody made whatever it was they were going to make. And I was going to slowly invite people out and get them to slowly establish themselves. Obviously, I was going to help them. And we were just going to make a nice little tight-knit community floating out over the void. Obviously, we would have had to child-proof quite a few things, but I think it could have been pulled off. Except when everybody started to arrive, next to none of them really wanted to build. They were happy sticking inside the central Sky Pillar pillar of autism. They didn't actually want to bridge out over the void and make their own things. They were afraid of falling. Remember, we didn't have elytra. In fact, this was almost 3 months before we even knew that elytra were going to be a thing. So obviously we had no idea of what to expect. I personally had a hack that prevented me from falling into the void. This was the glide and the fly hacks. These are very old hacks. What would happen is if you were gliding or flying inappropriately, the server would rubber band you back on top of whatever it was you were originally falling off of. This meant that you could actually prevent yourself from ever falling into the void, simply by not letting the server register you falling into the void. It was really quite ingenious. It actually saved my bacon more times than I can count. Very quickly after this, I phoned up a friend, Stupid Walrus, on Skype, and he had told me that about 7-8 months earlier, he had made an end base of his own. Back at this time, we had discovered that the end was generating bedrock. This is also the same bedrock that you can see today. It's the reason this bedrock exists. I called it at that time the bedrock strip, almost like a plane runway or a landing strip you would see at an airport. And it was perplexing at the time. We now understand why this was happening, but at the time it was novel and interesting, and so I told Stupid Walrus, hey, go out like 20 kilometers. Obviously, the mechanism to generate bedrock was not super easy. You had to update the lower areas of a chunk using blocks, and then the server would see that that is void and fill it in. So obviously, that was a tedious process, and Stupid Walrus had a fear of heights, and well, he just didn't go out that far. And you know, I'm kind of glad he didn't, but in retrospect, I should have had the wherewithal to go out farther all on my own. But at the same time, Stupid Walrus had already wrangled animals and villagers to this base. This little house on the edge of nowhere had a sort of quaint feeling to it. Walrus didn't build very high, as he said he had a fear of heights. So naturally, anything that was there was built with the sort of ground level aesthetic in mind. Everything was just as you saw it. There weren't impressive towers or big, large structures. Those would come later. I just decided, well, instead of building here out in the open, which is dangerous, I wanted to bridge off the edge of the bedrock and to actually build a properly hidden end base. One that I knew could stand the test of time. Well, one that I could only hope would stand the test of time. Obviously, we couldn't have known what we know now, but we'll get to that part of the story here in a bit. And so I began slaving away, slabbing and stone bricking and all the other miscellaneous things that I decided. But it's at about this point that a rather interesting feature had caught our attention. Ocean monuments. You see, ocean monuments were brand new. This was 1.8. The sea lantern, one of the most beautiful lighting blocks ever added into Minecraft, well, I just had to have them. But unfortunately, due to it being a very new block, well, we just didn't have any options on that front. Farming sea lanterns were the only option you had. The only bet was to just do it by hand. I initially thought about going out to a bunch of ocean monuments, as I had heard a few of them generated near and around spawn. And that's when XCC2 came to the rescue. He told me that an old, long-forgotten spawn base of his had suddenly generated an ocean monument under it. He and another friend of his, ZXCBW, decided that this was a great location near spawn, but not so close that it would immediately get stumbled upon. They set up a new little farm there of carrots and potatoes and wheat and the like, and immediately got to work creating an incredibly elaborate and very efficient, for the time, ocean monument farm that could instantly gather tons of guardians all at once. The spawn rates in those days were actually kind of out of hand again, not too dissimilarly from how the spawn rates are today. So bearing this in mind, I realized after being invited by XCC2 that this was the perfect opportunity to get the newest block and use it in my build. Naturally, I jumped at the opportunity and went back and forth between Space Valkyria 1 and XCC2's Prismarine Castle. All the while, I needed an efficient and quick method of traveling between both bases without leaving a cumbersome bridge from the bedrock to Space Valkyria 1. Clearly, an improvisation was needed, and exactly at that moment, I got super lucky. Pyrobite came to my rescue, as he would do multiple times throughout this video. Something genuinely amazing happened. A new type of glide exploit was discovered. Well, not discovered, rather revealed. For you see, Pop Bob, Tristan, and Pyro already long since had this glide of theirs in their back pockets. I also suspect other major hackers of knowing about it or possibly even using it, but at that time nobody was really openly making use of it, and it was basically tailor-made for travel in the end, even if the end didn't yet have the copious amounts of end islands that it now does. At that time, we were simply going to a place nobody knew about. It was entirely shrouded by the darkness of the void. If you didn't know about the base being there, you would have no way to know where you would be heading. So gliding aimlessly out into the void was, well, a death sentence. That is, unless you knew where you were going. And, well, that's exactly what I was going to do. And I would walk them all the way. I would painstakingly explain the process of triggering both the glide and properly navigating your way safely to the base. For you see, gliding alone wasn't good enough. You had to have either an ender pearl or land in water, because the glide was a very specific kind of movement exploit. It was not just a glide, it was a controlled fall. In truth, you would still be dealt whatever fall damage you fell. So for example, if over the course of your gliding, you walked 2 kilometers, but fell 64 blocks, you would still take 64 blocks worth of fall damage. And in an era before the totem and extra absorption hearts, that amount of fall damage was likely fatal. Even with the regen and the resistance and the 2 measly absorption hearts from golden apples in those days, you could still easily end up falling just enough to kill yourself on accident. Very annoying when what you're trying to do is prevent yourself from dying so that you can actually get to your base. And well, wouldn't you know it, that's what many of us inadvertently did, dying just before the finish line, as it were. Poor Sato and his Brazilian internet. He never was able to meet me at Space Falcon in person. His ping was just so bad, it was never possible for him to ever get there and survive. But, well, what can you do? It would not be long after I had gotten back to XCC2's Prismarine Castle that I would eventually find the now famous XCC2 Flaming Skull banner. This banner is a banner that I would adorn both Space Falcon 1 and many other future bases down the road, as this banner is easily the coolest banner I have ever seen. No banner has ever come close to matching the sheer awesomeness of this one particular banner. Soon, I would realize that I need an easier, more efficient way of getting into the end dimension. Traveling back and forth from spawn to XCC2's Prismarine Castle and then back again to the end, while not necessarily bad, would turn out to be quite troublesome, as currently there was an incursion going on. Naturally, I thought, what's a better location that I could eventually set out from? Eventually, I would want to be in the most efficiently placed area to both visit XCC2's castle as well as return to the end, without ever arousing any suspicion that there was anyone living actively and producing a base in the end. I knew that talking about and showing things was not necessarily a death sentence, but certainly not ideal. I had already learned by this point that talking about a base openly was probably the easiest way to get it on the radar of various people like Jared, X0XP, and of course Pop Bob, something I really didn't want to have happen. And naturally, this meant I had to keep the base as secret as I could. Now, you probably already know, you want to keep something a secret, you can't tell anyone about it. I did not respect or really fully understand this concept at that time, as not only would I tell both Pyrobyte and XCC2 about this, I would also tell my own loudmouth basemates. People who had been with me at the lands for literally years at this point. People who, unfortunately for me, would not realize the secrecy aspect of a base is its most carefully guarded aspect, as secrecy is more or less what guarantees a base, at least in the immediate present. Now I realize, of course, I myself stream my own base on 2B right now, and I'm also violating this exact idea. But hey, I'm a content creator now, so I kind of have to be that way. But back in the day, it was a more obvious thing to keep your mouth shut when it came to keeping, shall we say, secrets secret, or at the very least keeping your base less open and publicized. I nonetheless would find this problem out firsthand. As luck would have it, I would eventually introduce Tristan to the base. Now at this time, Tristan was actually quite the trustworthy guy. We'd known him a while, and he was more or less on board with the whole Space Valkyria idea, even though he wasn't necessarily happy with Sato's handling of Asgard 2. He wasn't overtly antagonistic or anything. We all just kind of figured that he was tired of, well, the Valkyria LARPing. Even in those days, there was kind of a people looking down on LARPing attitude. And so naturally, LARPing was not something we wanted to come off as. Sato was a very LARPy person. I mean, I can take that in small doses, but other people, not so much. Maybe they had reached their limits. At any rate, as soon as I had introduced Tristan to the base, he was floored, absolutely amazed. It was his idea then to go and visit the ruins of Camtown. For you see, Camtown town had a working end portal, one that had somehow remained secret for the last 3 years. Somehow it had evaded Housemaster's wrath after Tristan and Pyro had backdoored the server in late 2013. There were remnants of it still. This, of course, meant that we could slip into the end much more regularly and in an undetected fashion. After all, I had to basically forego having a bed of any kind to slum it around spawn and then slip into the end dimension while still kinda sort of participating in the third incursion. This meant that I no longer needed to actually go to spawn. Also, there were a lot of various dramas regarding the people at the third incursion, so I was beginning to get bored with it all. You can't really blame me. Everybody was quickly labeling each other as traitor to the cause. People were yelling at each other that they would kill them on sight. It was obvious that this had become a far more serious circumstance than it needed to be. Incursions were never meant to be taken so seriously. Unfortunately, you really couldn't tell that to the people in charge, nor could you tell that to the people who were gung-ho about destroying. To this day, I really don't know what it was they were trying to do. I just enjoyed the gathering as a whole. It was a fun little experiment to see how long an excursion at spawn could occur before people got fed up enough with it due to drama or what have you. And as history would later go on to show, incursions have a very poor track record of maintaining their steam for very long. Eventually, they all end up kind of imploding. This one was no different. And so I focused more on building Space Falcon 1. All the while, I would find the various peoples I wanted to add to Space Falcon, and I would scout them with fervor, including Silver Crown King, Sea Money 1-Up, and Lemonfoot. These guys were cool, and to this day I still talk to Silver Crown King. Sadly, Sea Money 1-Up and Lemonfoot kind of vanished at this point. I assume they went on to live their lives, not everybody sticks around on 2B2T forever, that kind of thing. It was sad to see them go, but understandable. It was then, on April the 23rd, that I would be met with some of the most amazing news. Infinite blocks had finally been re-enabled. In fact, all illegal items had been re-enabled. Housemaster, either through accident or simple chaos perhaps, maybe he was intentionally sowing some kind of chaos, Housemaster had suddenly re-enabled illegal items. This meant infinite items were all playable, completely and totally fair and free. And let me tell you, infinite items were some of the most busted things that I'd ever gotten to see. The item that you're seeing before you is the very first inf I ever laid eyes on, an infinite iron block, courtesy of XCC2. This iron block was literally billions of blocks compressed into a singular block, a special type of block that would decrement forever. As you placed them, they would simply lose their value. Eventually, they would bottom out at negative 127 and then roll over into the positives as Java variables are wont to do. Naturally, this meant that as long as you handled them correctly, you would never lose out on the boon they provided. We eventually got the bright idea, instead of placing them, to throw them into a dispenser, hook up a clock, and then just have a series of them fire over and over and over and over, all the while firing into a water stream that would then scoop up the blocks and put them into chests, making for an incredible stash of items deep into the end, even though 2 kilometers is hardly what I'd consider deep. But at that time, 2 kilometers into the end with no end islands, well, that was a fair distance. You'd have to bridge out far on your own to actually get that far, just because. You would have to want to do these things. This is just not something people did back in these days. Nobody realized the value of the end. However, there's another person whom we shall briefly mention in passing, who did actually understand the value of the end. And in much the same way as a parallel to the very first episode of Storytime with Jack, not only would I have my first end base found by a random person who had the exact same idea as I did, the now famous FitMC also had the same idea as we did. Only he was a little more careful in what he did. He wasn't so reckless as to say, oh my god, Jack has a base. He more or less kept to himself and then ran off into the depths of the end to make his own base. But at that time, well, we simply didn't know each other. And while I recognized him as Silent Pedro from the third incursion, as well as from Asgard 2, just as a fun little aside, I literally lived directly under him, and I just sort of felt it funny that we ended up accidentally reuniting and meeting again out in the end where seemingly no one would just randomly tread, but here we are. And so the infinite items allowed me to create one of the most beautiful bases at the time, and build I did. This was one of the few times in the old 2B2T era, pre-Rusher, where I genuinely felt a sort of zen experience while building. All the problems of the world seemed far away and unrelated to anything I did. I was truly living in my own world at that time. Later on, I would receive an infinite block of quartz from Pyrobyte, as well as the now infamous Spirit of Valkyria, a power 10 bow. Obvious leftovers from Pyro and Tristan's back door. But furthermore than that are the items that you are all very likely chomping at the bit to hear the most about. The infinite XP bottle and the farmland. Oh yeah, also there's the lit furnace, the special speed 2 potion, and command block or something, you know. Other than that, though, the building of Space Valkyria not only brought more people together in my group than ever before, it was also one of the most inspiring places I ever got to build at. Eventually, Pyrobyte offered me a singular piece of bedrock and told me to place it on the build wherever I wished. So naturally, I saw to setting it at the very foot of the build, at the very bottom, as a sort of cornerstone to all of Space Valkyria. Remember, we thought this would be a large, sprawling base. Didn't realize we'd only get this one tower and that would be the end of it. I was also bequeathed all of these wonderful heads, the player heads of people like O'Malley-Mix, Talo112, Pyrobyte, myself, Chris Layton, Pop Bob, Tristan, and Housemaster. Oh, and a ghast egg and some mob spawners too. Teehee. Yeah. This was probably some of the most epic stuff that I had gotten to do pre-Rusher. Genuinely amazing that any of this even came together the way that it did. Really, the beauty of Space Valkyria was not just that it was an awesome build. It was not just in a place that nobody would really think to look. It wasn't just that the infinite blocks had suddenly come back after literal years of being disabled. It wasn't just the whole, hey, everybody is mentally disabled and is at spawn fighting. It was the fact that 7 or 8 completely disseparate, all on their own interesting conditions, all came about simultaneously to produce the most epic base I'd ever gotten the privilege of building and living at. And unfortunately, that's what brings us to the end of this particular encounter. For you see, shortly after being able to complete the topmost part of Space Valkyria, the area that would eventually house the jungle, this is where our story takes a turn for the worse. After receiving an infinite grass block from Pyrobyte and painstakingly filling in the top area where the jungle would have gone, Pyrobyte AFK'd overnight using his greeter module and got hit by the now infamous Tell at A exploit. Tell at A was an exploit that could in very short time pinpoint someone's location with startling accuracy. All it took was simply whispering a few messages to a player. Now I know what you're thinking, how do whispering messages factor into finding someone's location? This is the nasty part. For you see, when you do a normal command, there are certain modifiers you can use. At that time, these modifiers were viable on 2B2T. Thankfully, they're not today, but at that time, they were absolutely manageable. At A, meaning to send a thing, in this case a tell or a private message, to all players on the server. Now, initially, this was just used to spam. After all, you could send everyone on the server the same message. That's obviously ripe for abuse, but not necessarily a coordinate exploit. So how does this unfortunately get worse? Well, you see, not only were you doing /tell at A, you were also putting brackets after the A. And in those brackets, you would open bracket, close bracket, and in between, you would specify the X, the Y, and the Z. And then you would tell your message. And for the sake of efficiency, people like Pop Bob, who were among the chief users and abusers of this exploit, they would simply type the letter A. So you would get spammed with the letter A over and over for no reason. Now, initially it came out that, again, everybody was just doing tell at A. So they were spamming the letter A in hopes of intercepting private messages, just to fuck with people, because they could, right? Now, obviously, a lot of people use Skype in these days. Very soon, a year later, we would all be using Discord. If you really wanted to say something special and you were careful, you wouldn't say it in 2B2T chat. However, very soon, we would stop receiving A's unless you were within a certain distance from spawn. For you see, the tell at A exploit had been further innovated. It was now a more sophisticated exploit. Now, you were not only spamming everyone online, you would be spamming everybody within a range, usually from 0 to whatever coordinate you've specified. So now you do tell at A and you say the letter A, but you've specified X 10,000, Y 65, Z 1,000. Now you are whispering everyone that message within those coordinates. No matter where or what, if they are within those coordinates, it's incredibly easy to narrow down their location. And very quickly, this meant that all bases could immediately be discovered. In just as little as 3 whispers, anyone could immediately tell where you were. You would specify a range of up to 1 million, note all the names of up to 1 million that you hit, and then just whittle down the numbers until the person you wanted to whisper to was no longer being whispered to. Now you had a range, and in that range, you could easily simply narrow it down. Farther and farther and farther until, bam, you had them. And you'd have them dead to rights, because realistically, what were they going to do? And so, that was the end of Space Valkyria. Or at least, the end of Space Valkyria 1. Even though Space Valkyria 1 was not very long, ultimately we only had like 2 months to build on the place, it was still a fun experience, one that I wanted to keep doing. And so we branched off a good 1.5 kilometers away, and we tried again, this time with Space Valkyria 2. And Space Valkyria 2 was a much more successful base, one that we would eventually shut down the entire end dimension to contain, one that we would also blame Jared 2013 for doing. Thanks, Jared. And of course, we had all of those nice blocks. Sadly, the infinite blocks were patched, but hey, we got a lot of good stuff, so at least there's that. And well, that concludes the story of Space Valkyria. By the beginning of June, the entire base had been lava casted by Jared. A lot of the player heads had been pilfered by him, and well, sadly, there just was no alternative. We would never see the O'Malley-Mix or Talo player heads again. The Cytotoxic T-Cell, my player head, Pop Bob's, Tristan's, and I believe Housemaster's player heads would all see circulation to some degree, though for a time, player heads were again illegal, and for a time, they would simply go into hiding. But I never forgot the beauty of Space Valkyria 1, and eventually, a year or so later, it would inspire me to recreate the beauty of Space Valkyria 1 with the sleek majesty of Space Valkyria 2 to produce my now magnum opus, Space Valkyria 3, a base that I hope to one day surpass. So, if you've been watching me all of this time, I greatly appreciate it. If you would please leave a like or some sort of a comment so that the algorithm can maybe pick up on this, and hey, who knows, maybe we'll get newer people in here one of these days to help spread the word. And other than that, if you would like to have future earlier access to my videos and other things like the Dr. Seuss parodies and so on that I'm doing, feel free to join the membership, as the people who do get access to these videos earlier. And last but not least, thank you all for being you, for just enjoying the fact that I make 2B2T content, for all the weird and crazy stuff that I sometimes ramble about, or whatever else may be out there waiting for us in our far future. You all have a great evening, stay safe, goodbye.